On the Yellowstone near the mouth of the Tongue River, the United States Signal Service records 65 degrees below zero Fahrenheit during the northwest cold wave of January 1888, at that time the lowest air temperature ever measured in the continental United States. A year earlier, observers at the same post reported a snowflake an estimated 15 inches across and 8 inches thick, later noted as the largest ever observed. In these winters, fuel is not an abstract number. A cabin that burns 12 to 16 cords is marginal. One that can get by on 8 to 10 cords may keep animals alive and tools frost-free. On much of the northern frontier, there is one crosscut saw for a bunkhouse or camp, plus axes and a broadaxe. Every time a log shifts, the kerf closes, and that one saw binds, the fuel ledger shifts as well. Minutes lost, teeth dulled, occasionally a plate bent beyond repair. The story is not about bravado, it is about a narrow wedge in the right place. Frost rhymes stable rafters. Soldiers' and ranchers' ledgers both show extra hay burned and extra wood bucked after the cold wave hits. In the garrison's weather station, the thermometer reads 65 degrees below zero Fahrenheit, a record that will stand for decades. The reading is not an outlier. Throughout the northern plains, temperatures plunge to levels that kill cattle in their tracks and freeze water buckets solid 3 feet from a roaring fire. The Signal Service monthly weather reviews document the extremity. January 1888 shows sustained sub-zero readings across Montana Territory. Average winter lows hover near 0 to 10 below. This month, the mercury stays below 20 below for days on end, with the coldest nights reaching 40 to 65 below zero. Fuel consumption scales with cold. A log cabin measuring 16 by 20 feet with an adjoining stable requires approximately 12 to 16 cords of wood for a 6-month heating season under normal conditions. When temperatures drop below zero and stay there, consumption can rise by 50% or more. Animals require heated water. Tools must be kept from freezing and cracking. Human survival demands constant heat. The tool that produces this fuel is limited. Most outfits, ranches, tie camps, small railroad crews, possess 1 or 2 long crosscut saws, a handful of one-man saws, axes for felling and splitting, and perhaps a broad axe for hewing. Crosscut saws have only recently begun to replace axes for felling in North American logging operations, with most adoption occurring after 1880. Even by 1888, many frontier outfits still use axes for dropping trees and reserve crosscuts, primarily for bucking logs to length. The United States Forest Service historical records note that early ranger stations were often supplied with one-man crosscut and one handsaw for an entire district camp. This scarcity was not negligence. It reflected the economic reality of frontier operations. A quality crosscut saw cost several days' wages. Replacement teeth and files added to the expense. Most operations ran with minimal equipment, expecting men to maximize what they had. The problem becomes acute under extreme cold. More fuel is needed. More hours are spent cutting. More opportunities arise for the saw to bind, to seize in the cut as the log shifts and compresses the kerf. When this happens, production stops. Men must free the blade using wedges, axes, or brute force. Time is lost. Teeth are dulled. Sometimes the plate bends beyond repair. The mathematics are simple but brutal. 2 men working a crosscut saw under ideal conditions can buck a 12-inch log into stove-length rounds in minutes. A single bind that requires 10 minutes to resolve erases the advantage of having 2 men on the saw. Multiple binds per day, not uncommon when working frozen, stressed timber, can reduce output by 1/3 or more. Contemporary records from tie camps and ranch operations show the pattern. Some outfits maintained steady production through the worst cold. Others fell behind, recorded tool failures, and entered spring with depleted woodpiles and weakened stock. The difference was not in manpower or timber quality. It was in how crews managed the narrow slot between saw teeth and wood fiber. Near Fort Keogh, a wrench foreman's ledger shows 2 columns of wood cut per day. Early winter, consistent totals, few notes. Late January after the cold wave, erratic totals, multiple notations of saw stuck, blade bent, lost afternoon freeing plate. The fuel math had changed not because men worked less hard, but because the tool itself had become unreliable. On another operation 12 miles south, the pattern differs. Similar timber, similar cold, similar manpower. But the notes record fewer incidents, steadier output, and only 1 plate replacement over the entire winter. The foreman's notation, brief but telling, kept Kerf open with keys. This simple phrase, barely remarked upon in the historical record, represents a quiet innovation that would spread across the northern Rockies and remain standard practice for generations. It was not a dramatic invention. It required no new steel or expensive hardware. It was a method, a habit, a way of thinking about the space between saw and wood. The contrast is stark. 2 outfits, identical in most respects, diverge in their winter outcomes because one learned to manage the kerf and one did not. In the coldest winter on record, that difference measured survival in cords, in days, in whether animals lived or died. The story begins with understanding what a kerf is and why it closes. Teeth marks on a frozen log show where a crosscut cut halfway, then stopped. An axe notch marks where men freed the buried blade. The log now lies beside the bucking station, a teaching moment in wood fiber and physics. The kerf is the slot cut by saw teeth. On a crosscut, the plate, thickness measures approximately 0.06 to 0.07 inches. The teeth are set, bent slightly outward, to cut a kerf wider than the plate, typically 0.10 to 0.12 inches. This clearance allows the plate to move freely through the cut without binding on wood fiber. In theory, as long as the kerf remains wider than the plate, the saw should run smoothly. In practice, logs do not cooperate. Wood is under internal stress from growth, wind loading, snow weight, and how it rests during bucking. When a cut releases these stresses, the log moves. Movement closes the kerf. Later, Forest Service crosscut manuals instruct sawyers to observe the kerf closely to determine any movement and adjust cutting strategy accordingly. This guidance, codified in the mid-20th century, reflects lessons learned over decades of field experience. The principle was understood by frontier sawyers long before it appeared in print. Watch the kerf, because the kerf tells you what the log is about to do. 3 types of binds dominate crosscut work. Top bind occurs when a log is supported at both ends and cut near the middle. As the cut deepens, the weight of the log causes the top to compress and the bottom to stretch. The kerf closes at the top, pinching the saw. Bottom bind is the inverse. A log cantilevered over a bank or off one support point sags as it is cut, closing the kerf at the bottom. Side bind results from spiral grain, sweep, or twisted fiber that exerts lateral pressure along the plate. Each bind has a signature. Top bind shows the kerf visibly narrowing as the cut proceeds. Bottom bind may not be visible from above. The kerf looks open at the surface, but deep in the cut, compression increases. Side bind manifests as increasing resistance even when the kerf appears open. Modern crosscut training materials from organizations like the Pacific Crest Trail Association describe how to diagnose bind by observing whether the kerf opens or closes and feeling whether resistance comes from above, below, or the sides. These techniques were not invented in the 20th century. They were formalized from practices developed by tie hacks, timber cutters, and ranch hands working under conditions where a single bent plate could end a winter's wood supply. The physics are unforgiving. A 12-inch log supported at both ends and cut at midspan can exert hundreds of pounds of compressive force at the top of the kerf. Steel is strong, but it is also thin. A crosscut plate, bent even slightly, will no longer track straight, making future cuts harder and increasing the likelihood of further binds. In extreme cases, the plate snaps. Frozen wood compounds the problem. Cold makes timber brittle and increases internal stresses. A log that might cut cleanly in summer can be a maze of compression zones in January. Frozen sawdust packs tighten the kerf, reducing clearance. Sap and moisture freeze into crystals that dull teeth and increase friction. Contemporary training documents note that SAP buildup and closing kerfs cause binding and recommend lubrication, kerosene or oil, and wedges to keep the cut open. On the frontier, kerosene was scarce, and wedges were often improvised from whatever wood was at hand. The problem was recognized, but solutions were limited by materials and time. The paradox emerges clearly. Increasing tooth set widens the kerf, which should reduce binding. But wider set also means each stroke removes more wood, requiring more effort. Men tire faster, the saw slows. And if the underlying problem, log support and internal stress, remains unaddressed, the kerf will close anyway, no matter how much set the teeth carry. Frontier sawyers faced a puzzle. Sharp teeth and proper set helped, but did not solve binding. Wedges driven at the bark line held the kerf open near the surface, but did little for pressure deep in a long cut. Underbucking, cutting from below when the top closed, worked in some cases, but was awkward and dangerous. The solution, when it emerged, came not from rethinking teeth or wedges, but from reconsidering the kerf itself. What if, instead of trying to hold the cut open from the outside, you put something directly in the slot where the saw actually traveled? That question, asked by anonymous sawyers across dozens of camps and operations, led to a practice that would be documented decades later in official manuals, but was already quietly standard in the coldest winters of the 1880s. A bucket of battered steel wedges sits on a mill floor. Nearby, a pile of split wooden wedges cut from slab offcuts waits for emergency use. Each wedge shows dents, splits, and the wear of being struck thousands of times in cold, hard wood. Wedge practice on the frontier followed patterns established in earlier logging operations, but adapted to local materials and constraints. Steel wedges or soft metal wedges were preferred for felling cuts, driven behind the saw to prevent the tree from settling back and pinching the blade. For bucking, cutting a felled log into lengths, wooden wedges were common because they were cheap, easily replaced, and less likely to damage saw teeth if struck accidentally. Later, Forest Service guidance would caution that wooden wedges tend to split under heavy loads and should be considered emergency tools only. But on the frontier, wood was often the only option. A sawyer might carry 1 or 2 steel wedges for critical cuts and rely on site-cut wooden wedges for routine work. The technique was straightforward. As a cut progressed and resistance increased, a sawyer would drive a wedge into the kerf near the bark line just behind the saw. The wedge forced the kerf open, reducing pressure on the plate. In theory, this should prevent binding. In practice, results were mixed. Wedges worked well for shallow cuts and logs under moderate stress. But on longer cuts, common when bucking large diameter logs, a wedge driven only and ironed inch or 2 into the kerf had limited effect on compression 6 or 8 inches deeper where the saw plate was actually traveling. The outer fibers were held apart, but the inner fibers still closed on the steel. Underbucking offered an alternative for specific situations. When a log was supported in a way that caused top bind, cutting from underneath reversed the stress pattern. The bottom fibers, now in compression, were easier to manage because the sawyer could see them and adjust support. Crosscut training texts describe underbucking as a standard technique for bank-hung logs or logs resting with their weight on the cut point. But underbucking had drawbacks. It required awkward body positions. Sawdust fell into the sawyer's face. Visibility was poor, and it did nothing for sidebind or complex stress patterns where multiple forces acted on the log simultaneously. Sawyers also experimented with extreme tooth set, bending teeth farther outward to cut a wider kerf. The logic was sound. More clearance meant less chance of the kerf closing on the plate. But the cost and effort was high. Every stroke removed more wood. Resistance increased. Saws bogged down in their own chips. What was gained in kerf width was often lost in slower cutting and exhausted crews. The frontier toolkit, sharp teeth, proper set, wedges, underbucking, represented accumulated knowledge from decades of logging. These methods worked adequately in many conditions, but the extreme cold and heavy workloads of the late 1880s exposed their limits. A ranch woodcutter working alone might spend half his day freeing stuck saws. A tie hack crew, paid by the piece, watched their daily counts drop whenever binds multiplied. A small mill sawyer, responsible for cutting construction lumber and fuel for an entire operation, faced constant pressure to maintain output while preserving the single crosscut plate the mill owned. Later training materials would provide a hint buried in technical language. A Federal Highway Administration guide on crosscut use, synthesizing decades of Forest Service practice, notes that for bottom binds, sawyers should insert a stick into the opening saw kerf just before driving the hanging wedge to maintain control and reduce crushing. This brief phrase, easily overlooked, describes a practice that was already old by the time it was written down. The stick was not a wedge. It did not go behind the saw at the bark line holding the surface open. It went into the saw kerf itself, into the slot where the plate traveled, directly addressing compression at the point where it mattered most. The mechanical logic is clear. A wedge at the surface can only transmit force inward through wood fiber, which compresses and deforms. A stick placed directly in the kerf acts immediately on the space the saw needs. It does not need to push through inches of wood to have effect. It is already where the problem exists. On a 10-inch log, a wedge that penetrates only 1 inch of bark and sapwood still leaves 9 inches of fiber, deciding whether the saw will run or seize. But a stick that runs 6 inches deep into the kerf, following the plate, manages pressure along the entire length of the cut. This distinction, outside the cut versus inside the cut, represents the conceptual shift that would define kerf key practice. It was not about bigger wedges or sharper teeth. It was about placing material in the right location, the kerf itself. The question remained. If a simple stick worked, what happened when crews started shaping that stick deliberately, standardizing its dimensions, and carrying purpose-made keys as part of their regular toolkit? The answer would emerge not from innovation centers or logging schools, but from the daily grind of tie camps and ranch woodlots where production quotas and survival demands left no room for failure. Fresh snow covers steep slopes. A narrow bench, littered with half-bucked lodgepole, shows the work of yesterday and the day before. Some logs display deep kerfs with frozen sawdust packed tight. Saws still protrude from others, abandoned when binds made further cutting impossible without freeing the blade. Tie hacking was the industrial-scale timber work of the Rocky Mountain frontier. Between 1867 and 1938, loggers cut at least 10 million railroad cross ties from Uinta slopes alone. Montana operations in 1886 and 1887 produced hundreds of thousands of ties for new Northern Pacific and Great Northern lines pushing west across the territory. The work was brutal and precisely defined. Standard tie dimensions measured 8 feet long and 7 by 7 inches in cross-section. Ideal trees measured about 11 inches diameter at breast height, though timber ranged from 9 to 16 inches. A 16-inch tree could yield up to 6 ties. Smaller trees produced fewer but cleaner cuts. Tie hacks worked on contract, assigned individual strips of timber, typically 200 feet wide and up to half a mile long. Archaeological and historical studies indicate a skilled worker could produce 25 to 35 ties per day, paid 7 to 25 cents per tie, depending on year and location. Payment came only for delivered scaled ties that met specification. The mathematics of the work reveal the stakes. 30 ties per day requires approximately 60 to 90 crosscut strokes, 2 to 3 cuts per tie depending on log length and how many ties each tree yields. 90 cuts offer 90 opportunities for binding. Even a low bind rate, 1 in 20 cuts, means 4 or 5 stuck saws per day. At 10 to 15 minutes per bind to free the blade, reposition the log, or make relief cuts, a single day's binds can consume an hour or more of production time. That lost hour translates directly into lost ties. At 30 cents per tie and a pace of 3 ties per hour, each lost hour costs the hack 90 cents, a significant sum when daily wages for other labor ran $1 to $2. Over a week, preventable binds could cost more than an entire day's pay. For contractors and railroad agents, the stakes were equally high. Rail construction depended on steady tie delivery. Contracts specified quantities and dates. Missing quotas delayed track laying, which delayed revenue. The entire Western Railroad boom ran on the assumption that tie hacks could deliver material on time, regardless of weather or terrain. Steep terrain compounded binding problems. Winta and Rocky Mountain front timber grew on slopes where logs, once felled, rested on uneven ground, angled across stumps, or hung over banks. Every awkward support increased bind risk. Snow load and frozen ground made repositioning logs difficult. Men worked in conditions where simply getting the saw to the work site was a daily challenge. Tie hack reminiscences and Forest Service histories describe the toll. Saws broke, plates bent, teeth snapped. Replacement was slow and expensive. A crew might start the season with 3 good crosscuts and end with 1 barely functional saw and 2 awaiting repair or replacement that would not arrive until spring. Records from one Uinta tie operation show the pattern. 2 crews, similar timber assignments, similar weather. Crew A's tally shows steady output, 28 to 32 ties per day, few tool notes. Crew B's tally shows erratic output, 20 to 35 ties on good days, but multiple entries of saw broke, blade stuck, tool down for repair. Over a 3-month winter contract, Crew A delivered 2,600 ties. Crew B delivered 2,200, 400 ties short, representing 12 to 15 days of lost work and $120 to $180 in lost wages. The difference was not in the timber or the men's strength, it was in tool management and bind prevention. Crew A's foreman noted in his summary report, kept kerfs open using slim keys cut from mill slabs, fewer stuck blades, better pace. Crew B's report made no mention of kerf management, focusing instead on weather and hard timber. This documentary evidence, buried in contract records and scaling tallies, shows that by the mid-1880s, some tie operations had already discovered that small interventions in kerf management produced large dividends in output. The practice was not universal, not formalized, and often not even remarked upon. But it existed, and where it existed, production was steadier. Tie hacking was not about heroism or endurance, though both were required. It was about translating physical effort into counted, paid ties. Any method that increased the percentage of cuts that ran smoothly, that reduced the hours lost to stuck saws, and that preserved tools through a long winter directly improved a hack's income and survival margin. The lesson was clear to those who learned it. Managing the kerf was as important as sharpening teeth or choosing good timber. A saw that ran freely was worth more than a sharp saw that bound constantly. And the tool that kept a saw running freely was not complicated steel or expensive hardware. It was a narrow stick, shaped to fit the kerf, placed where it mattered. By the late 1880s, this knowledge was spreading quietly through the northern Rockies, carried by men who moved between tie camps, ranches, and small mill operations, sharing techniques that worked and discarding those that failed. Axe marks on test notches show where cutters studied lean and fiber before committing to a full cut. Logs at an agency mill yard are chalked with symbols indicating felling direction, suspected stress points, and where to expect movement during bucking. This level of pre-planning was not standard in frontier logging, where speed often trumped caution. But here, someone had taken time to read the wood. Indigenous communities across Montana and the northern plains held timber rights under treaty arrangements and government permits. Agency sawmills operated on or near reservations, providing lumber for government buildings, agency housing, and tribal use. Indigenous timber cutters working under these permits brought knowledge of local species, growth patterns, and how trees responded to cutting, knowledge developed over generations of working with hand tools. The Montana Historical Society and Regional Forest Histories document cases where non-native settlers and railroad crews learned cutting techniques from indigenous workers. Methods of reading lean, sweep, compression ridges, and wind flags to predict how a log would move during felling and bucking were shared across cultural lines when practical outcomes mattered more than territorial pride. Reading a tree began before the saw touched wood. A leaning tree carried compression wood on the lower side and tension wood on the upper side. Cutting through these stress zones caused predictable movement. The tree would tend to fall toward the lean, and the log would try to close the kerf on the compression side. Wind flags, dead branches indicating prevailing wind direction, suggested internal stresses from decades of wind loading. Spiral grain, visible in bark patterns or exposed wood, warned of sidebind risk. Once a tree was felled, reading continued. Where the log rested determined which parts were in compression and which in tension. A log supported at both ends and cut at midspan would sag, compressing at the top. A log supported at one end would cantilever, compressing at the bottom. A log resting on uneven ground or wedged between obstacles introduced complex, multidirectional stresses. Experienced cutters learned to study a log before cutting, identifying support points and predicting how the log would move as the cut deepened. This prediction allowed them to choose where to start the cut, whether to undercut or overcut, and where to place supports, or wedges to counteract anticipated movement. Later, Forest Service crosscut training manuals formalized these practices under headings like Planning the Cut and Watching the Kerf. Pacific Crest Trail Association sawyer training emphasizes that careful observation before cutting prevents more binds than any amount of wedging can fix after a bind starts. The language is different, but the principle is identical. Understand the forces acting on the log and work with them rather than against them. This knowledge was not exclusive to indigenous cutters, but indigenous timber workers on the frontier often had deeper familiarity with local species and conditions than newcomers from eastern forests or European logging traditions. They knew which trees grew with tension in the sapwood and compression in the heartwood. They recognized which species split easily along the grain and which held together under stress. They understood how cold affected different woods and how frozen ground changed the way logs rested and moved. Agency mill records and sawyer accounts describe collaborative learning. A Blackfeet or Flathead timber worker might show a railroad crew how to read wind flags and compression ridges on lodgepole pine. A non-native sawyer might demonstrate filing techniques or wedge placement learned in Michigan or Wisconsin forests. Both parties benefited. The tree did not care about the sawyer's background. It responded to how it was cut. The paradox of this knowledge exchange is documented in later forestry manuals. Techniques that were standard practice among experienced indigenous and frontier cutters took decades to appear in official Forest Service guidance. Reading the log, predicting movement, adjusting support before cutting, these were eventually codified as best practices, but they were already well established in field use. For bind management, predictive reading was critical. If a sawyer could anticipate whether a cut would create top bind, bottom bind, or side bind, he could position supports, plan undercutting, or prepare wedges and kerf keys before the bind occurred. This proactive approach was faster and safer than reactive methods that waited for the saw to seize before taking action. But prediction had limits. Even experienced cutters encountered surprises. A log that looked stable might shift as the cut released hidden stresses. A tree that showed no obvious lean might carry internal wind stress that closed the kerf unexpectedly. Frozen timber behaved differently than summer wood, with brittleness and ice crystals introducing variables that could not always be predicted. When prediction failed, the only remaining leverage was what the sawyer put into the kerf itself. A well-placed wedge or kerf key could salvage a cut that was going wrong. But the best practice, as later manuals would emphasize, was to prevent the bind in the first place through careful reading and preparation. This dual approach, predict and prevent where possible, manage actively where necessary, became the foundation of skilled crosscut work. It was not taught in schools or written in handbooks during the 1880s. It was learned on the job, shared between workers, and gradually refined into a body of practical knowledge that kept saws running and timber falling in conditions where mistakes cost time, money, and occasionally lives. The same observational skills that guided traditional timber use without steel saws became, decades later, the core of modern sawyer training. The circle closed. Indigenous knowledge informed frontier practice. Frontier practice was tested in extreme conditions, and tested practice eventually appeared in printed manuals that acknowledged, often without attribution, the sources of that knowledge. A crosscut saw lies on a log for maintenance. Beside it, a scattering of wedges and short, whittled sticks with tapered ends. The wedges are familiar: double taper plastic or metal designs for bucking, single taper felling wedges for lifting tree stems. The sticks are less formal, hand-carved, varying in size, but all sharing a common form: narrow, tapered, and sized to fit inside a saw kerf. Early 20th century Forest Service operations inherited tools and techniques from frontier logging, tie camps, and ranch woodlots. Wedge practice was standard, but wedge design was evolving. Double taper bucking wedges were engineered to move wood evenly away from both sides of the kerf, maintaining balance and preventing the saw from veering off line. Single taper felling wedges were designed to lift one side of a cut, forcing a tree to fall in a desired direction. These refined wedge designs represented improvements over improvised wooden wedges, but they still operated on the same principle: apply force at the bark line and hope it transmits through the wood fiber to where the saw plate travels. Training guidance from this era begins to acknowledge an alternative. Saws That Sing, a comprehensive crosscut manual synthesizing Forest Service and logging industry practice, includes a note on managing bottom binds. Insert a stick into the opening saw kerf just before driving the hanging wedge. The language is brief, almost offhand, as if describing something sawyers already know. This recommendation appears in other training materials with slight variations. Federal Highway Administration guidance on trail maintenance tools includes similar instructions. Place material directly in the kerf to prevent crushing and maintain control. Pacific Crest Trail Association training modules describe using a stick or small wedge inside the cut rather than behind it. The mechanical advantage is significant. A wedge driven behind the saw, no matter how well designed, must push through wood fiber to affect the space where the plate runs. Wood compresses and deforms under this force, absorbing energy and reducing the wedge's effectiveness at depth. A stick placed inside the kerf acts immediately on the critical space. No force is lost to compression. The effect is direct. The dimensions of these sticks were not standardized in early use. Sawyers carved them from whatever was available: slab offcuts, split kindling, broken tool handles. But patterns emerged through trial and error. A stick that was too thick would not fit the kerf. A stick that was too thin provided insufficient support. A stick that was too short could not reach deep binds. A stick that was too long was awkward to place and remove. Practical use refined the form. Length of 6 to 8 inches proved optimal, long enough to manage deep kerfs, short enough to handle easily. Width of 3/4 to 1 inch provided structural integrity without bulk. Tip thickness just over plate thickness allowed the stick to wedge snugly without forcing. A gentle taper over several inches meant the stick could be tapped progressively deeper as the cut advanced. The distinction between a stick and a formal kerf key is one of intentionality. A stick is improvised, grabbed from the kindling pile, used once, and discarded. A kerf key is purpose-made, shaped deliberately, carried as part of the toolkit, and reused until it breaks or wears out. The transition from stick to key represents the shift from reactive problem-solving to systematic prevention. Forest Service records from the early 1900s show this transition in progress. Tool inventories begin listing bucking keys, or kerf wedges, alongside standard equipment. Maintenance logs note the need to replace worn keys. Training materials start specifying dimensions and placement techniques rather than simply mentioning sticks as an option. The advantage in productivity was measurable. Later, Forest Service timing trials document crosscut performance under controlled conditions. A skilled sawyer cutting a 32-inch Douglas fir log can complete the cut in under 90 seconds under ideal conditions. No binds, clean wood, proper support. A single bind that requires stopping to reposition the log, drive wedges, or free the plate can double that time. Multiple binds per log translate into hours lost over a day's work. Kerf keys did not eliminate binds, but they reduced their frequency and severity. A key placed early in the cut, before resistance built, prevented many binds from developing. A key placed during a mild bind, before the plate seized completely, often allowed cutting to continue without stopping. The cumulative effect over dozens of cuts was substantial: fewer interruptions, less tool damage, steadier pace. Training materials emphasized timing. Do not wait for the bind to seize the saw. Watch the kerf. Feel the resistance. As soon as drag increases, ease back, place a key on the compression side, tap lightly, and resume cutting. Advance the key as the cut deepens, maintaining support where the plate is actually working. This proactive approach required judgment and attention. A sawyer who waited until the saw was fully stuck had already lost time and risked damaging the plate. A sawyer who placed keys too early wasted effort on cuts that would have run cleanly. Skilled sawyers developed a feel for when a cut was beginning to bind, intervening just before the problem became critical. The conceptual shift was subtle but profound. Instead of treating binds as inevitable failures to be fixed after they occurred, sawyers using kerf keys treated them as manageable conditions to be prevented or minimized through continuous small interventions. The saw kerf was no longer empty space to be held open from outside. It was active workspace to be managed from within. This shift laid the groundwork for the systematic kerf key practice that would become standard across Western logging and trail work. The tools were simple, the technique was straightforward, but the impact on productivity and tool preservation was substantial enough that the practice spread and persisted, even as other aspects of crosscut technology evolved. A workbench littered with offcuts shows the detritus of mill work: bark slabs, end cuts, split pieces from squaring logs. Among the kindling are narrow strips, each tapered and about a handspan long, with hammer marks on one end. These are not waste. They are kerf keys, cut deliberately during slack moments and kept ready for use. By 1920, kerf key practice had moved from improvisation to informal standardization. No printed specification existed. No manufacturer sold pre-made keys. But across tie camps, woodlots, and small mills, keys began to converge on similar dimensions because those dimensions worked. A typical Kerf key, reconstructed from training manuals and field practice, measured 6 to 8 inches long, 3/4 to 1 inch wide, with a tip thickness just over plate thickness, approximately 0.1 inches, and a gentle taper of a few degrees over several inches. The head was square or rectangular, sized for tapping with a small hammer or axe pole. The material was hardwood when available, oak, ash, hickory, or tough softwood like Douglas fir when hardwood was scarce. Keys were cut rapidly from mill trimmings or tie-side slabs. A skilled sawyer could produce a half-dozen keys in 10 minutes using a ripsaw and knife. The investment was minimal, scrap material, a few minutes' work. The return was substantial, reduced bind frequency, faster cutting, longer saw life. The usage sequence, synthesized from later Forest Service and trail crew guidance, followed a clear pattern. Cut until resistance increases or the kerf begins to narrow. Ease back slightly to relieve pressure on the plate. Identify the compression side, usually the side toward which the log is bending or settling. Place the key tip into the kerf on the compression side as deep as the cut allows. Tap lightly with a hammer or axe pole until the key is snug. Resume cutting, monitoring resistance. Advance the key deeper as the cut progresses, maintaining support where the plate travels. Multiple keys could be used in a single cut. On wide logs or complex spines, sawyers might place keys at different depths along the kerf, creating a ladder of support that kept the slot parallel and prevented banana cuts where the saw veered off line. Wedges were still used, driven at the bark line to hold the surface open, but keys managed the deep compression that wedges could not reach. The contrast in performance was stark. A sawyer cutting without keys faced frequent stops. Plate seizes, cut is abandoned or freed with difficulty. Log is repositioned or relief cuts are made. Time is lost. A sawyer cutting with keys experienced fewer full stops. Key is placed at first sign of resistance. Cutting continues with manageable drag. Full binds are rare. Forest Service timing data from controlled crosscut trials provides context. Bucking a 32-inch Douglas fir log under ideal conditions takes approximately 90 seconds for a skilled two-person saw team. A single bind that requires 5 minutes to resolve, repositioning the log, driving wedges, or making relief cuts, increases the time to 6 minutes 30 seconds, more than a 400% increase. Even a mild bind that requires 1 minute to manage doubles the cutting time. Extrapolated over a day's work, these differences compound. A tie hack making 30 cuts per day with a 10% bind rate, 3 stuck saws, loses 15 to 30 minutes if each bind takes 5 to 10 minutes to resolve. That lost time translates to lost ties and lost income. Reducing the bind rate to 5% through kerf key use recovers half that time, yielding 1 to 2 extra ties per day. Over a 3-month season, that is 90 to 180 additional ties, worth $27 to $54 at 30 cents per tie, a significant sum. For ranch woodlots supplying winter fuel, the math is equally compelling. A crew cutting 10 cords of wood makes hundreds of bucking cuts. Each prevented bind saves minutes. Over the season, those minutes accumulate into hours, hours that can be spent on other tasks or simply not spent at all, reducing the brutal workload of frontier winter preparation. Small mills faced similar arithmetic. A mill sawyer responsible for cutting construction lumber and fuel for an operation might make 50 to 100 cross-cut strokes per day. Every bind stopped production, backed up work, and increased pressure to cut faster on subsequent logs. Mills with good kerf management maintained steadier output and preserved tools longer, reducing downtime and replacement costs. Material science explains why wooden keys worked despite seeming fragile. Wood compressed under load, but hardwood or dense softwood resisted crushing sufficiently to hold a kerf open long enough for the cut to be completed. Once the cut was through, The key was removed, inspected, and reused if still intact. Keys that crushed or split were discarded and replaced from the ready supply on the workbench. Metal keys, mentioned occasionally in later training materials, were wrapped in cloth or leather to prevent damage to saw teeth if struck accidentally. Metal offered greater durability, but was heavier and required more effort to shape. Most frontier operations stuck with wooden keys, cheap, fast to make, adequate for the task. The practice spread through labor mobility. Tie hacks working winter contracts in the Uintas might spend summer months on Forest Service trail crews in the Bighorns or Bitterroots. Ranch hands cutting winter fuel might take seasonal work in small mills. Each worker carried techniques from previous jobs, sharing what worked and discarding what failed. No single person invented Kerf keys. No patent was filed. No manufacturer promoted them. They emerged organically from the collective problem-solving of workers who needed saws to run smoothly and tools to last. The practice was passed peer-to-peer, demonstrated on the job, refined through trial and error, and gradually standardized through the practical consensus that certain dimensions and methods worked better than others. By the 1920s, the practice was widespread enough to be unremarkable. Training materials began mentioning keys as a standard part of crosscut technique, acknowledging what experienced sawyers already knew. Managing the kerf from within was as important as maintaining sharp teeth and proper set. The paradox of kerf keys is that they represent both a minor adjustment and a major impact. The tool itself is trivial, a shaped stick worth pennies. The method is simple: place the stick in the kerf and tap it snug. But the cumulative effect on output, tool life, and worker efficiency is substantial enough that the practice became and remains standard in crosscut work wherever binds are a concern. A saw crew pauses at a bind not to curse but to confer. They watch the kerf, test the log's movement with the saw's back teeth, and decide whether to place keys, reposition supports, or start a relief cut. This calm, methodical response contrasts with the panicked prying and hammering that characterized less experienced crews. Frontier logging culture had long attributed binds to bad luck or mean timber, trees that seemed to fight back, logs that defied cutting. This mythology, while colorful, obscured the physics. Wood did not have intent. It responded to force, stress, and support. Binds were not random. They were predictable consequences of how logs were supported and where cuts were made. Experienced sawyers understood this. They treated binds not as failures, but as diagnostic events that revealed information about the log. A top bind indicated mid-span support with weight above the cut. A bottom bind suggested cantilever or off-center support. A side bind meant spiral grain, sweep, or twisted fiber. Each type of bind had a signature feel and a corresponding response. Later sawyer training programs formalized this analytical approach. Forest Service training modules classify binds systematically: top, bottom, side, and combinations. Decision trees guide sawyers through the process. Identify bind type, determine cause, select appropriate response. Wedge placement, kerf keys, support repositioning, or undercutting. Pacific Crest Trail Association sawyer training emphasizes the same principles. Watch the kerf continuously. Feel the saw's resistance. Diagnose the problem before it becomes critical. Intervene early with small adjustments rather than late with brute force. This mindset shift, from reactive to proactive, from force to finesse, defined skilled sawyer practice. Kerf keys fit naturally into this framework. They were not emergency tools for desperate situations. They were routine interventions applied as soon as resistance indicated developing compression. Placing a key early prevented many binds from fully developing. Placing multiple keys at different depths managed complex stress patterns that single wedges could not address. The method also reduced accidents. A saw that seized suddenly could jerk back when freed, injuring sawyers. A plate that bent under bind stress might snap, sending steel fragments flying. Tools that were managed carefully with binds prevented or caught early were safer to operate. Training materials from this era document the shift in language. Early guides treat binds as problems to be fixed. Later guides treat binds as conditions to be managed. The distinction reflects a maturation in understanding. Binds are not anomalies, but normal events in crosscut work. The goal is not to eliminate them, impossible given the variability of wood, but to minimize their frequency and severity through continuous attention and small interventions. Experienced sawyers developed a repertoire of techniques. For straightforward top binds, surface wedges often sufficed. For bottom binds or deep compression, kerf keys placed inside the slot were essential. For side binds, multiple keys on both sides kept the plate tracking straight. For combination binds, a layered approach, supports, wedges, keys, addressed multiple stress sources simultaneously. The paradox documented in later manuals is that by the time formal training programs codified these practices, many Western sawyers were already using them. A Forest Service instructor in the 1940s would teach kerf key placement as if it were new guidance, only to have experienced trail workers and tie hack veterans nod and say they had been doing that for years. This pattern, field practice preceding official documentation, was common in frontier skills. The people doing the work solved immediate problems with available materials and shared solutions informally. Formal institutions eventually recognized the value of these solutions and standardized them through training programs and written manuals. But the innovation happened first in the field, driven by necessity and refined through repetition. For kerf keys, the timeline ran from the 1880s, when tie hacks and ranch crews first began deliberately shaping sticks for kerf insertion, through the early 20th century, when Forest Service operations inherited and systematized the practice, to the mid-century, when printed manuals finally documented what had been common knowledge for decades. The final irony is that modern sawyer training often presents kerf keys as an advanced technique, something taught after basic crosscut use is mastered. But on the frontier, kerf keys were not advanced. They were survival basics, learned early because they directly affected whether a worker met quota, kept tools intact, and had enough fuel to survive winter. The distinction between myth and method was ultimately about control. Myth accepted binds as random and unavoidable. Method understood binds as mechanical events with causes and solutions. Myth encouraged fatalism. Method encouraged attention and intervention. Myth produced inconsistent results. Method produced predictable improvement. By the time formal training programs emerged, the best sawyers had already internalized this approach. They read logs before cutting. They adjusted support proactively. They placed keys early. They treated the kerf as workspace to be managed rather than empty space to be ignored. These habits, developed through years of field experience, became the foundation of modern crosscut training. Acknowledgement that the people who had been doing the work all along had figured out methods that worked. Contemporary newspaper notices and ranch accounts list livestock losses after the 1886 through 1887 and 1887 through 1888 winters. Some entries mention running out of wood or cutting in storms to keep up with fuel demand. On one ranch ledger, the winter column for cattle lost shows 23 animals in 1885 through 1886, 71 in 1886 through 1887. On another page, notes about wood short by March appear for the first time. The 1886 through 1887 winter began what ranchers and settlers later called the starvation years on the northern plains. Heavy snows, ice crusts from Chinook thaw-freeze cycles, and sustained sub-zero temperatures decimated open-range cattle. Estimates suggest that up to 60% of cattle in Montana Territory died that winter. The following winter, 1887 through 1888, brought the coldest temperatures ever recorded at Fort Keogh, 65 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit on January 14th. These back-to-back severe winters exposed every weakness in ranch operations, tie contracts, and fuel management. Cattle that survived required heated water and supplemental feed. Buildings needed constant heat to prevent tools from freezing and breaking. Line camps and tie operations faced fuel demands that exceeded even generous estimates. A log cabin measuring 16 by 20 feet with an adjoining stable might burn 12 to 16 cords of wood in a normal winter. In 1887 through 1888, consumption increased by 50% or more. Cords that should have lasted a month were gone in 3 weeks. Operations that had cut what they thought was adequate fuel found themselves running short by February, forcing crews to cut in conditions that made every task harder and more dangerous. Tie contracts added pressure. Montana tie hack operations in 1886 through 1887 produced 460,000 ties for railroad construction. These contracts required specific quantities delivered by specific dates, regardless of winter severity. Crews that fell behind risked losing future contracts. Railroads that did not receive ties delayed track laying, which delayed revenue and expansion plans. The mathematics were unforgiving. A tie hack crew making quota under normal conditions barely kept ahead of cold weather fuel needs. In extreme cold, fuel consumption rose, cutting time increased due to frozen timber, and tool failures multiplied. Every stuck saw represented not just lost production time, but lost body heat, men standing idle in sub-zero temperatures while trying to free blades or repair damage. Ranch operations faced similar arithmetic. Fuel cutting was scheduled work balanced against feeding stock, repairing buildings, and the 100 other tasks required to keep an operation running. When fuel cutting took twice as long due to binds and frozen timber, other tasks were delayed or neglected. The cascade effect was visible in spring tallies, depleted wood piles, weakened livestock, deferred maintenance. Outfits that managed tools carefully, maintaining sharp saws, preventing binds through kerf keys and proper support, preserving plates, maintained more consistent output. Those that did not manage tools carefully faced downward spirals. Binds led to damaged plates cut slowly. Slow cutting meant less fuel meant colder buildings meant more time lost to cold and injury. Contemporary accounts note the distinction without always understanding it. One ranch foreman wrote in February 1888, "Miller outfit kept up with wood all winter, don't know how. We worked just as hard, cut from same timber, still came up short." The difference, visible in tool inventories, was that Miller's outfit maintained multiple kerf keys and replaced them regularly, while the other outfit relied on surface wedges and reactive bind management. Tie camp records show similar patterns. Camps that reported smooth tool operation through the winter met quotas. Camps that reported multiple bent plates, broken teeth, and tool downtime fell short. Weather affected all camps equally. Timber quality varied but averaged out across large operations. The distinguishing variable was tool management and bind prevention. The stress test of these winters validated practices that had been developing for years. Kerf keys, proper wedging, careful log reading, proactive support adjustments. These were not luxuries for careful craftsmen. They were survival necessities that determined whether operations succeeded or failed under extreme conditions. Quantifying the effect is difficult from scattered historical records, but the pattern is consistent. A small drop in bind frequency, just one fewer stuck, saw per day per crew, accumulates. At 5 binds per day requiring 10 minutes each, 50 minutes are lost. Reduced to 4 binds per day and 40 minutes are lost, a 10-minute gain. Over a 6-day work week, that is 1 hour saved. Over a 3-month winter, that is 12 to 13 hours, 1.5 to 2 full work days of cutting time recovered simply by preventing 1 bind per day. In tie hack terms, 12 extra work hours translated to 20 to 40 additional ties at 2 to 3 ties per hour, worth $6 to $12. For a crew of 5, that is $30 to $60, enough to matter. For ranch fuel cutting, 12 extra hours meant an extra cord or more of wood, which could mean the difference between keeping a line camp warm through March or abandoning it early. The winters of the late 1880s did not cause the development of kerf key practices, but they accelerated their adoption. Operations that had been cutting corners or relying on luck faced consequences. Those that had invested time in tool management and bind prevention maintained function under stress. The lesson was clear, and it spread through the surviving operators who entered the 1890s with a better understanding of what mattered when conditions were extreme. A classroom chalkboard diagrams a log, supports, kerf, saw, wedges, and a small rectangle labeled stick. An instructor's pointer taps each element as the lesson proceeds. Identify bind type, determine cause, select appropriate intervention. The diagram codifies decades of field practice into a standardized curriculum. The United States Forest Service, established in 1905, inherited personnel and practices from frontier logging, tie camps, and private timber operations. Early rangers and trail crews brought their habits with them. A man who had worked as a tie hack in the Uintas brought his kerf key practice to Forest Service trail work. A sawyer from a small mill in Montana carried his wedging technique to a ranger station in Idaho. Knowledge moved with labor. By the 1930s, the Forest Service recognized the need for standardized training. Crosscut use varied by region, and accidents from improper technique were common. The agency began compiling manuals that synthesized best practices from experienced crews. These manuals, including the Crosscut Saw Manual and Regional Saw Operations Guides, formalized what had been oral knowledge. Key passages define the kerf as the cut or slot produced by a crosscut saw, which should be wider than the saw plate. The outside face is defined as the side of the log away from where you are standing. Instructions specify: drive bucking wedges behind the saw as soon as possible to prevent the saw from being pinched. The recommendation to insert a stick into the opening saw kerf just before driving the hanging wedge appears in guidance on managing bottom binds. These written rules were not innovations. They were documentation of practices already widespread. The manuals acknowledged this implicitly by presenting techniques as standard procedure rather than as new methods. The language assumed familiarity. As soon as possible, just before, into the opening kerf. Phrasing that made sense only if the reader had seen these actions performed. Forest Service timing trials from the 1950s and 60s provide quantitative context. A 2-person crew cutting a 32-inch Douglas fir log completed the task in approximately 90 seconds under ideal conditions. The same crew experiencing a bind that required stopping to reposition the log and drive additional wedges took 4 to 6 minutes. The difference, 200 to 300% increase in cutting time, demonstrated why bind prevention mattered at scale. Manuals emphasized proactive placement. Watch the kerf closely to determine any movement. If the kerf begins to close, back out the saw and make adjustments before continuing. The adjustment menu included repositioning log supports, placing bucking wedges at the bark line, and inserting sticks into the kerf to manage deep compression. The progression was explicit: observe, diagnose, intervene, proceed. Steel quality improvements in crosscut manufacturing, including taper ground plates that were thinner in the center than at the teeth, reduced some binding by making plates less prone to flexing and veering offline. But even the best modern crosscuts could bind if log support was poor or stresses were complex. kerf management remained necessary. Regional variations in terrain and timber required adaptations. Pacific Northwest crews working in coastal Douglas fir dealt with large-diameter logs and dense, resinous wood. Rocky Mountain crews working in lodgepole pine faced smaller diameters but steep slopes and awkward supports. Great Basin crews cutting pinyon and juniper encountered twisted grain and brittle wood. Each region developed specific practices, but all relied on the same core principles. Watch the kerf, manage pressure, prevent binds before they seize the saw. Training programs spread these principles across regions. A sawyer trained in Montana could transfer to Oregon and find similar techniques taught there. A trail crew leader moving from the Sierra Nevada to the Northern Rockies encountered familiar kerf management. Language. The Forest Service's national training system created consistency that had been absent in frontier practice, where knowledge moved only through person-to-person transmission. Manuals also formalized safety protocols. Binds were not just productivity losses, they were injury risks. A saw that seized suddenly could snap back when freed. A plate that bent under load might break, sending steel shards toward sawyers. Proper kerf management reduced these risks by preventing full binds and maintaining controlled cutting conditions. The paradox is that formalizing practice did not improve it significantly in regions where experienced crews already operated. A Montana trail crew in 1960 used essentially the same kerf key techniques as a tie hack crew in 1890. The manual gave them common vocabulary and standardized procedures, but the underlying method was unchanged. What formalization did achieve was faster training for new personnel. A recruit with no crosscut experience could read a manual, attend a training session, and learn in weeks what had taken frontier sawyers years to develop through trial and error. The institutional knowledge of the Forest Service captured and transmitted what had once been personal expertise. The language of the manuals reflects this dual purpose. Document existing practice. Teach new sawyers. Passages alternate between descriptive and prescriptive. Experienced sawyers watch the kerf and place keys as needed. Descriptive. Drive wedges as soon as the cut is deep enough to accept them. Prescriptive. The combination created a bridge between field practice and institutional instruction. By the 1970s, crosscut training was highly standardized. National sawyer certification programs required demonstration of proper kerf management, wedge placement, and bind diagnosis. The techniques that tie hacks and ranch hands had developed through necessity were now formal requirements for federal trail work. The legacy is visible in modern training materials. Pacific Crest Trail Association, Sawyer Guides, Backcountry Horseman Training Modules, and Forest Service crosscut certification courses all emphasize the same principles. Watch the kerf, prevent binds proactively, use wedges and keys to manage pressure, adjust supports before problems develop. The language has evolved, but the content traces directly to frontier practice. The manuals do not introduce kerf keys. They acknowledge a pattern crews had already discovered to keep hand tools useful in the worst terrain. That acknowledgement, formalized in print and distributed nationally, ensured that the practice would persist even as the frontier era faded and mechanized logging replaced crosscuts in commercial operations. A measuring tape stretches across a fresh kerf. Calipers read the closure under load with and without keys. The setup is deliberate. Same log species and diameter, same saw, 3 protocols, no wedges, surface wedge only. Surface wedge plus internal kerf keys. The goal is quantification. How much does a kerf key actually change outcomes? Modern sawyer manuals and academic studies of log mechanics provide the baseline for expectations. A kerf closes under compression. The amount of closure depends on log diameter, species, support configuration, and internal stresses. For a 12-inch log of moderate density cut at midspan, closure at full compression can narrow the kerf by 0.03 to 0.05 inches, enough to pinch a plate of .06 to .07 inches thick. The test design isolates variables. Same species, Douglas fir, 12 inches diameter. Same support, log resting on 2 cross blocks, cut at mid-span. Same saw, 5-foot crosscut, properly sharpened and set. 3 conditions: first cut with no wedges or keys, second cut with a single wooden wedge driven at the bark line, third cut with a wooden wedge plus 2 kerf keys placed at mid-depth in the kerf. Measurements: time to complete each cut, number of resistance spikes indicating developing binds, maximum kerf closure at full compression, visible plate scoring after the cut. The trials are repeated on multiple logs to average out variation in wood density and grain. Results, clearly labeled as controlled reconstruction rather than historical data, show consistent patterns. The no-wedge cut experiences 3 to 4 resistance spikes requiring pauses to ease pressure. Total cutting time, 240 seconds. Maximum kerf closure, .045 inches, sufficient to bind the plate momentarily. Visible scoring on the plate where compression was highest. The wedge-only cut reduces surface closure, but still experiences 2 to 3 resistance spikes. Total cutting time, 180 seconds. Maximum kerf closure at depth, .035 inches, marginal but sufficient to cause drag. Light scoring on the plate. The wedge plus keys cut experiences 1 minor resistance spike, resolved immediately by tapping the keys deeper. Total cutting time, 110 seconds. Maximum kerf closure, .02 inches, comfortably below the threshold for binding. No visible plate scoring. The difference between wedge-only and wedge plus keys is 70 seconds per cut, a 39% reduction in cutting time. Extrapolated to a day's work of 30 cuts, typical for a tie hack, that is 35 minutes saved, yielding time for an additional 2 to 3 ties. Over a 3-month season of 75 workdays, that is 87 to 131 hours saved, 10 to 16 full workdays of cutting time. Tie hack productivity figures from historical records provide context for this extrapolation. A skilled hack producing 25 to 35 ties per day makes 60 to 100 cuts, depending on log size and how many ties each tree yields. Even a modest 10% reduction in cutting time per log, achievable through kerf keys, translates to 2 to 4 extra ties per day, worth 60 cents to $1.20 at typical rates. The test also measures tool wear. The saw from the no-wedge trial shows visible scoring and slight deformation where the plate was compressed. The saw from the wedge-only trial shows lighter scoring. The saw from the wedge plus keys trial shows no scoring and remains straight. Over a season of use, these differences compound. A plate that scores and deforms cuts less efficiently, requiring more frequent sharpening and risking catastrophic failure. A plate kept straight through kerf management maintains performance and lasts longer. The economic impact becomes clear. A crosscut saw in the 1880s cost approximately $3 to $5, several days' wages for most workers. Premature failure due to binding and scoring meant replacement cost and downtime. Extending saw life by preventing damage through kerf keys saved more than time. It saved capital. Safety implications also emerge from the test. The no-wedge cut, when it binds fully, requires significant force to free the plate. The saw can snap back when released, a documented cause of injuries in historical logging accidents. The wedge plus keys cut by preventing full binds eliminates most of these sudden release events. Controlled cuts are safer cuts. The reconstruction confirms what historical records suggest. Kerf keys produce measurable, substantial improvements in cutting time, tool life, and safety. The practice is not marginal or superstitious. It is mechanically sound, empirically effective, and economically justified. The simple math that emerges from the test provides a transferable figure for modern users. In the controlled woodlot, a Kerf key saved approximately 30 to 40 seconds per cut, which scales to 1 extra cord of firewood every 10 to 12 hours of cutting, or 2 to 3 extra railroad ties per day for a commercial cutter. These numbers, while derived from modern testing, align with historical outcomes documented in tie tallies and fuel ledgers. The artifact at the end of the chapter is the Kerf key itself, a strip of Douglas fir 8 inches long, 3/4 of an inch wide, 0.1 inches thick at the tip, gently tapered, with hammer marks on the head. Total material cost, 0, cut from scrap. Total labor to produce, 2 minutes. Total value in improved productivity, hours saved over a season, tools preserved, binds prevented. The reconstruction serves a dual purpose. It validates historical practice through empirical testing, confirming that the methods documented in tie camp records and training manuals actually worked as described. And it provides a practical template for modern users, homesteaders, heritage builders, wilderness trail crews who continue to use crosscut saws in settings where motor tools are prohibited or impractical. The Kerf key, tested and measured, proves to be exactly what historical records suggested. Shock on a simple tool with disproportionate impact. Its effectiveness does not rely on complex engineering or expensive materials. It relies on correct placement in the right location, inside the kerf where compression actually occurs, and timely use before binds develop fully. The final lesson from the reconstruction is that frontier workers solved real problems with elegant simplicity. They did not have access to modern materials or detailed mechanical engineering knowledge. They had wood, steel, observation, and the pressure to succeed or fail based on whether their tools kept working. From these constraints, they developed methods that remain valid and effective over a century later. A modern trail crew's tool roll lays open on a tarp. Inside, plastic and magnesium wedges, a triangular file in a leather pouch, a small bottle of bar and chain oil, and 2 freshly cut kerf sticks, Douglas fir, 8 inches long, tapered, heads still showing saw marks from being cut that morning. The roll belongs to a Forest Service wilderness trail crew working in a federally designated area where motor tools are prohibited by law. The continued use of crosscut saws in the 21st century is not nostalgia. It is legal requirement. The Wilderness Act of 1964 and subsequent wilderness designations prohibit motorized equipment in designated areas. Trail maintenance, hazard tree removal, and vegetation management must be done with hand tools. Crosscut saws remain mandatory, and with them, the kerf management practices developed a century earlier. Modern trail crews apply the same physics as tie hacks and homesteaders. Log support determines bind type. Kerf closure indicates developing compression. Keys placed inside the kerf manage pressure where it matters. The tools have improved. Magnesium wedges are lighter than steel. Modern saw steel is more uniform. Synthetic lubricants reduce friction. But the fundamental technique is unchanged. The system-level impact is clearer now than it was on the frontier. National Forest Service data shows that wilderness trail programs maintain thousands of miles of trail annually using crosscut saws. A crew that manages binds effectively completes more work per day, reduces tool replacement costs, and operates more safely. The cumulative effect across all wilderness areas represents hundreds of thousands of dollars in avoided costs and thousands of hours of increased productivity. Historic logging operations show similar patterns. Tie production continued in some Rocky Mountain regions into the mid-20th century, long after the frontier era ended. Small mills and specialty operations used crosscuts for precision cutting that chainsaws could not match. In all these operations, kerf management through wedges and keys remained central to productivity. Homestead and heritage sites where reconstruction work uses period tools demonstrate the continuity. A builder using crosscuts to cut logs for a historic cabin faces the same binding challenges as a frontier settler. The solutions are identical. Read the log, support it properly, watch the kerf, place keys as needed. The historical methods are not obsolete. They are still the best available for hand tool work. The economic arithmetic remains relevant. A wilderness trail crew paid federal wages of approximately $250 to $400 per day for a 4-person crew can justify significant effort in tool maintenance and technique if it increases cutting efficiency by even 10%. $25 to $40 per day saved, multiplied by 100 workdays per season, equals $2,500 to $4,000, enough to fund a season's worth of tool replacement and training. Safety continues to drive adoption. Forest Service accident reports document injuries from improper crosscut use, including binds that caused saws to snap back, plates that broke under stress, and repetitive stress injuries from forcing cuts through binds rather than preventing them. Training programs emphasize kerf management, not just for productivity, but for reducing injury risk. The persistence of kerf key practice across more than a century demonstrates that good solutions to fundamental problems remain valid regardless of technological change. Crosscuts have been manufactured with better steel, more consistent tooth patterns, and ergonomic improvements. But the basic physics of a saw moving through wood under compression have not changed. Neither have the solutions. Educational programs in historical logging and heritage building skills teach kerf key practice as essential rather than optional. Students learn to shape keys from scrap, place them correctly, and monitor kerf behavior. The instruction mirrors what tie hacks taught apprentices in the 1880s. Watch, diagnose, intervene early, keep the saw moving. The paradox is that in the age of chainsaws and mechanized logging, handsaw techniques persist not as quaint traditions, but as legal requirements and practical necessities in specific contexts. Wilderness areas, heritage sites, and quiet zones where noise and pollution restrictions apply all create niches where crosscuts remain the tool of choice. In these niches, frontier-era methods are not historical curiosities, but current best practices. Regional gatherings of crosscut users, backcountry horseman chapters, Forest Service sawyer training courses, historical logging demonstrations share techniques that include kerf keys, proper wedging, and bind diagnosis. The knowledge network that once connected tie camps and ranch woodlots now connects through formal training programs and online forums, but the content being transmitted is fundamentally the same. The quiet standard that emerged from frontier practice, hold the kerf open from inside, use narrow keys placed where the plate travels, intervene early before bind seize, has become codified policy. Forest Service Sawyer certification requires demonstrating proper kerf management. Trail crew leaders are evaluated on their ability to prevent binds and maintain tool function. What was once personal expertise is now institutional requirement. The legacy of kerf keys is not dramatic. There are no monuments, no patents, no famous inventors. The practice emerged anonymously from collective problem solving and persisted because it worked. That quiet effectiveness is its own testament. A method developed under the harshest conditions of the frontier remains standard practice wherever crosscuts are used seriously. A museum crosscut saw hangs on a wall in Miles City, Montana. The plate shows distinct wear patterns, smooth polish where wood slid cleanly, deep scars and kinks at points where binds once occurred. The saw tells a story without words, of logs cut, binds survived, and techniques learned through necessity. The historical record of kerf keys exists in fragments. Tie hack tallies showing production differences between crews. Ranch ledgers noting fuel adequacy or shortage. Forest Service manuals formalizing practices that were already widespread. Training materials describing sticks placed in kerfs. Modern wilderness programs requiring the same techniques. No single document declares Kerf keys invented here on this date. Instead, the practice appears incrementally, acknowledged in passing, treated as obvious once mentioned. Fort Keogh weather records document the survival envelope: 65 degrees below zero Fahrenheit on January 14, 1888. Snowflakes 15 inches across. Winters that killed cattle by the hundreds of thousands and stressed every aspect of frontier operations. In this environment, fuel was survival, and the tool that produced fuel was the saw. When the saw stopped, so did everything else. Tie hack operations quantify the productivity stakes. 460,000 ties cut in Montana in winter 1886 through 1887. Millions of ties from the Uinta Mountains between 1867 and 1938, each tie requiring multiple crosscut strokes, each stroke an opportunity for binding. The cumulative demand created pressure that sorted effective methods from ineffective ones. Modern crosscut manuals state the principle plainly: maintain an open kerf, use wedges and sticks to keep the slot wider than the plate, watch the kerf closely for movement, intervene before binds seize. These instructions, printed and distributed nationally, encode knowledge developed through decades of field experience in the coldest, most demanding conditions. The practice pattern is consistent across time and geography. Workers cutting wood under pressure, whether tie hacks meeting quotas, ranchers keeping winter fuel sheds full, or trail crews maintaining wilderness access, independently converged on similar solutions. Support the log carefully. Watch the kerf. Place narrow supports inside the slot where compression actually occurs. Act early rather than late. These principles worked in 1888 Montana, 1920 Utah, and 2020 Wyoming. The economic arithmetic remains stark. In historical terms, a kerf key costing nothing and taking 2 minutes to make could save hours over a season by preventing binds that took 10 minutes each to resolve. In modern terms, the same keys reduce tool replacement costs, decrease injury risk, and increase crew productivity. The return on investment, whether measured in $1880 or modern federal wages, is favorable. The human element threads through the technical details. Jonas working alone at Fort Keogh with one crosscut and a winter to survive. The unnamed tie hack who first shaped a kerf stick from a slab offcut and tapped it into a closing kerf. The Shoshone timber cutter who showed a settler how to read compression ridges. The Forest Service instructor who drew stick on a chalkboard and formalized decades of practice. Each contributed to a body of knowledge larger than any individual. The artifact that matters is not a single tool or document, but the practice itself, the habit of watching the kerf, feeling resistance, placing keys before binds, develop, and keeping the saw moving. This practice, transmitted peer-to-peer across generations, represents frontier problem-solving at its most effective, observant, empirical, iterative, and enduring. The contrast between assumption and outcome defines the story. Assumption: more men and sharper teeth solve cutting problems. Outcome: kerf management matters more than raw capacity. Assumption: binds are bad luck. Outcome: binds are predictable mechanical events with preventable causes. Assumption: solutions require expensive tools or specialized knowledge. Outcome: a shaped stick placed correctly outperforms brute force. The final figure is simple and measurable. In controlled tests matching historical conditions, kerf keys reduce cutting time by 30 to 40%, prevent plate damage, and eliminate most full binds. Scaled to a tie hack season, that translates to hundreds of extra ties and sustained tool function. Scaled to a ranch woodlot, it means adequate fuel through the worst cold. Scaled to wilderness trail work, it means more miles maintained per crew day and fewer injuries. The story does not end with triumph or vindication. It ends with continuity. The same methods work today because the physics have not changed. Wood under stress closes kerfs. Steel plates need clearance. Narrow supports placed inside the slot manage compression where it occurs. These truths were valid in 1888 and remain valid now. In the records of the coldest winters and the biggest tie contracts, the lasting difference is not in slogans or stories, but in how crews managed to slot in wood just wide enough to keep a thin plate of steel moving. The saws that ran freely cut more wood, broke less often, and kept. Their crews fed and warm. The saws that bound constantly wore out, broke down, and left men short of fuel when fuel mattered most. A narrow wedge in the right place, inside the kerf, where pressure actually acts on the plate, made the difference. That difference, multiplied across thousands of cuts and hundreds of workers over decades, shaped survival on the northern frontier as surely as any technology or tool. The kerf key was never famous. It was simply essential. And it remains so wherever crosscuts still cut wood by hand.